Presented by Caltech.
"50 years ago, more or less, someone had a big idea. Actually, most likely 50 years ago, many people had big ideas, but only one that matters to us tonight. Sometime in 1965-66, Caltech's leadership decided that humanities and social sciences were moved from a focus on teaching to a balance between teaching and research. It also decided that focus on the humanities would be changed to balance the humanities and the social sciences. That led to the renaming of the division to the Division of the Humanities and the Social Sciences from its old name, the Division of the Humanities. Then Caltech embarked on recruiting a new crop of humanists and social scientists over a small number of years. People like Robert Rosenstone, who's in the audience, Dan Kevles, came to Caltech. And last year, someone had a small idea. It'd be good to celebrate the progress we have made over the past half century. And as part of this celebration, to have a series of talks that display what is unique about this division at Caltech and in academia. There's a brochure describing all the talks. Do pick one up later. From a small idea came an even better one, the choice of the first speaker of the series, Dan Kevles. Dan came to Caltech in 1964 as an assistant professor and retired from the J.O. and Julia Copley Chair as Professor of Humanities in 2001 to join the faculty at Yale University, where he retired last year. Beyond serial retirements, Dan is the author of some very important books in the history of science, among which I am proud to own The Physicist, published in 1978, In the Name of Eugenics, 1985, and The Baltimore Case, 1998. And then after he moved, I stopped buying his books. He's also the author of a vast slew of scholarly and popular press articles. And tonight he will speak about Between the Archives and the Athenaeum, Caltech as Living History. Dan, welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Jean-Laurent, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to the organizers who who had a very small idea to bring me back here for this occasion. It's an honor and a privilege to speak to you, and also to have spent several days reflecting on the history of the division and the development of the archives and what I learned as a historian of science here at Caltech. When Kathy Yerka first approached me about this last summer, she said that part of my task at least was to reflect on how being at Caltech, and I spent 35 years here, shaped my work and thinking as a historian. So I'm going to be a little bit autobiographical, but I'm going to try not to be too much autobiographical. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. So, both the Athenaeum and the germ of what became the archives figured prominently in my own introduction to Caltech. I first came to the Institute sometime in early 1962 when I was doing research for my doctoral dissertation at Princeton on the history of physics in the United States. My aim was to interview physicists here and to look into whatever relevant historical materials might be available. The bus from LAX dropped me off at the Green Hotel in Pasadena at Raymond and Green. I don't know what's there now, but it's no longer the Green Hotel. I had no idea where to stay, so I got off and booked a room booked into the Green. The Green was a drab dowager of a hotel. The bed was a lumpy affair that seemed to date from the Civil War, and the dining room, a cavernous space decorated with potted palms, banquettes, and formica-looking tables, all bathed in soft-colored lights, green and red and yellow, was empty except for 3 other patrons, all of whom seemed to me very ancient. When I telephoned Lee Dubridge's secretary, Edith Baker, the next day to set up an appointment with him, she said, "Where are you staying?" I told her, and she said, "Oh, you can't stay there. That's terrible. Why don't you come over to the Athenaeum? I'll get a room for you." I packed my bags and I moved to the Athenaeum, blessing Edith Baker as soon as I saw the place. At some point during my stay, one of the scientists I met told me that Robert Millikan's files were on campus and that a man named Roger Stanton knew about them. I was very interested in Millikan in general because of his renown as a physicist, but also particularly because he had headed the mobilization of science in World War I, especially the effort to develop effective means of detecting submarines, all of which I was writing about, or trying to write about. Roger Stanton was a member of the English faculty, and he doubled as a librarian at the Institute. He took me to the basement of ARMS, the geology building, one of the geology buildings, and pointed out to me 6 or 7, as I recall, 4-drawer file cabinets in a dimly lit space. These were the Robert Millikan papers. Opening one drawer after another, I realized that I had stumbled onto a treasure trove of materials not only for science in World War I, but also for Caltech and American physics during Millikan's time, that is, the first half of the 20th century. I talked with a number of Caltech scientists, mostly physicists, on that trip. Lee Dubridge, Bob Bacher, Charles and Thomas Lauritsen, and also Linus Pauling, who generously gave me a copy of his book, No More War. I think that was pretty close to his last year at the Institute, 62. I learned a good deal about their backgrounds and careers, their attitudes towards the nuclear arms race and issues in science and national security, such as the security case of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Whenever I could, I popped down to the basement of ARMS and hurriedly took notes on submarine detection, wishing that I had time to work through all the file drawers. All the while, I relished my residence at the Athenaeum under the gaze of Millikan and hail and noise. Good. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. I found myself at the Athenaeum again 2 years later. In February 1964, I was just finishing my doctorate and had been invited to Caltech for a look over as a potential assistant professor in the humanities division. It was one of those glorious midwinter weekends of blue skies and bright sunshine bathing the mountains. Looked pretty good to me, having come from Princeton, New Jersey. I was interviewed and scrutinized for 3 days and generously wined and dined for 2 nights. The first was several historians at the home of Rod Paul, a leading scholar of the American West. The second night at the home of Hallett Smith, the division chair, and a brilliant student of Elizabethan literature, who plied me with sparkling conversation and a great deal of bourbon until around 2 o'clock in the morning. Here's Rod on the left. I don't know who's with him, and Hallett with Jenny Joy LaBelle, later a member of our faculty. A few hours after I got home, I stopped by to see a friend who was playing string quartets on Catalina Avenue, and we went out to the Chef's Broiler on Colorado. It's no longer there, and had breakfast. And I think I fell into bed about 4:30 in the morning. A few hours later, just before I was to leave for the airport, Hallett came to the Athenaeum to say goodbye. I thought this was just a gesture of courtesy, but as we sat on one of the couches in the great living room, he offered me a job and gave me a week to decide. I didn't need a week. The conditions of the job were excellent, but there were also so many other attractions. The Millikan papers sitting in those file cabinets, the inviting opulence of the Athenaeum, and everything in between, including my home to be the Division of Humanities and the prospect of living in a place where you could wear shirt sleeves, you could walk out around in shirt sleeves in the middle of February. It was a no-brainer. I said yes before the week was out. I arrived in Pasadena with my wife, Betty Ann, and our 3-year-old daughter, Beth, at the beginning of September 1964, and was installed in an office in the basement of Dabney Hall. At the time I arrived, the division was beginning to rumble with initiatives for changes that Jean-Laurent alluded to, but not quite as he has it, if you'll permit me. Change in both scope and character for the division. The initiatives soon produced the transformation into the Division of the Humanities and Social Sciences that occurred 50 years ago this month, and that the lecture series that begins with mine today both marks and celebrates. I will, in a little while, tell you how I benefited as a historian of science by being at Caltech, how the Athenaeum, the archives, and the Caltech community in between figured as living history in the development of my work. But I want first to spend a bit of time turning myself, if you will, into living history, to provide some insight into how and why the transformation in the division occurred when it did. The ideas concerning scope, changing the scope of the division, were, I believe, connected to the issue that the physicist and novelist C.P. Snow had raised in his provocative and influential essay of about 1960, as I recall, called The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. Snow's main point was that science and technology were transforming the world, and that citizens in democratic societies knew too little about them to participate knowledgeably and intelligently in a world teetering on the edge of nuclear Armageddon. Educators and cultural critics responded to Snow's books by calling for better education, or better educating non-scientists in the sciences. And that's where courses, for example, in physics for poets originated. At Caltech, however, members of the humanities division and some of the science faculty interpreted Snow's provocation with efforts to bridge the two cultures in the opposite direction. That is, by building bridges from the humanities and social sciences to the sciences. In a sense, the division had been doing this for a long time, requiring requiring students to take courses in history, literature, and industrial relations, as well as business economics. But the aim had been to give students a patina, if you will, of culture, a patina of liberal education in an Edwardian sense, and prepare them for the practical world of business to which many of them were headed. That's the industrial relations part, business economics. Now, in the wake of Snow's Two Cultures, a number of the Institute scientists involved in advising the government and of the divisional faculty counted it advantageous to instruct students in public affairs, especially in science, technology, and foreign policy, and to establish public affairs in general as an intellectual presence on the campus. It may have been that the move to hire a historian of science, which turned out to be me, derived from that very same impulse. The effort, whatever the case there, the effort to bolster the social sciences most certainly originated with that purpose in mind. I say bolster because at the beginning of 1964, social science was already represented by 8 professors, or about 1/3 of the professorial faculty. Half were macroeconomists. The rest covered political geography, business economics, industrial relations, and psychology. The drive to bolster the social sciences was spearheaded in a division by a coalition of several of these faculty and a few of the historians, all of whom had considerable experience in teaching and thinking about science and national security, as well as economic development in the Third World. So the initial idea was to hire social scientists who would deal with such issues in science and society, especially in foreign affairs. The effort produced the acquisition of Thayer Scudder, a social anthropologist with extensive postdoctoral experience in African field work. He joined the faculty in 1964, the same year that I did. It was in recognition of the social science faculty already in place and of the ambitions to expand in the field that in January 1964, the trustees of Caltech approved the change of the division's name to the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences. Later that year, and in the next three more economists were added to the faculty, including Roger Knoll, a Caltech graduate and then a new PhD from Harvard in microeconomics, and a senior institutional economist named Burton Klein, who specialized in national defense and technological innovation and had been at the Rand Corporation for a number of years. And then also, I think it was this initiative that helped bring Morgan Cousar to Caltech, a historian, but with a very social scientific orientation. Bert Klein was quirky, iconoclastic, and exceptionally knowledgeable about the economics profession. He took the lead, as I recall, in our continuing search for social scientists and was largely responsible for finding and hiring Lance Davis. There. Who came to Caltech as a full professor from Purdue in 1968. Bert wanted a first-rate institutional economist, not primarily someone who would bridge the two cultures at Caltech through instruction in public affairs or broader issues in science and society. In recruiting Lance, he chose exceptionally well. Lance was 40, already a highly distinguished economic historian, a brilliant pioneer in the application of economic theory and quantitative analysis to the development of financial and business institutions, mainly at that time in the United States. Lance was energetic, ambitious to develop theoretical quantitative politics and economics at Caltech, and at once somewhat gruff in manner, but hard-nosed and visionary in pursuit of these goals. His appointment, together with that of Roger Knoll, marked a milestone because it turned the future of social sciences at the Institute away from a focus on science and society and towards a program of high distinction in micropolitics and microeconomics. Lance's appointment in 1968 coincided with increasing agitation, of which I was a part, for change in the character of the division. Not only change in scope, but change in character at the same time. I hasten to add that life for the division's faculty was pretty good. The teaching loads were light, the faculty friendly, the salaries very good, and the secretarial support for even junior faculty in humanities unheard of anywhere else in the academic world. The agitation thus did not center on unhappiness or any unhappiness with the material quality of life. It was energized by increasing dissatisfaction with certain features of the division's character on the part of a number of junior faculty like myself, new faculty like Lance, and several senior faculty, notably Rod Paul and Robert Huttenbach, who was an accomplished historian of topics in the British Empire and at the time the popular master of student houses. To summarize our dissatisfactions, scholarship was more allowed than encouraged. It was not held against you, but it was not divisional policy, or for that matter, institute policy at the time, to promote it or require it for tenure. In connection with that orientation, it was sometimes difficult to obtain funds for research, especially if it meant travel to archives on the East Coast. Hallett's procedures in making appointments were also questionable, to put it mildly. Take my own appointment. I learned later that Rod Paul telephoned Hallett later that Sunday morning in February to say that the search committee should meet sometime to decide on whether to offer me a position. Hallett told him, not necessary. I already offered him a job. By 1968, Hallett had been chair for about 20 years. Chairs in several other divisions had been in office as long. I think of, for example, Carl Anderson in physics and Fred Lindvall in engineering. But I doubt that any of them ran their divisions in Hallett's baronial fashion. Hallett could still be good company, and he remained a brilliant scholar, but us agitators thought it was time for him to step down. Hallett and his allies resisted, but to Harold Brown, who was appointed Caltech's third president in 1969, change in the division's leadership and policies made altogether good sense. Hallett's chairmanship ended in 1970. He was succeeded by Bob Huttenbach, first as acting chair, and then in 1972 as full chair in his own right. Here's Bob. Huttenbach led the way in establishing scholarly promise and accomplishment as criteria for appointment and promotion, along with teaching and service in the division and the institute. He obtained and made readily available resources for research and brought the faculty procedurally into decisions on curriculum, hiring, and programs. And at some point early in his presidency, Harold Brown established the policy that division chairs were appointed for 5 years, a 5-year term, and could be renewed for a second, but 2 terms was the limit. Is that still the case, Tom? Yeah, I do too. Meanwhile, Huttenbach, with strong advice from Lance Davis and Roger Knoll and support from Harold Brown, expanded the social science faculty still more, bringing in several exceptionally promising junior economists and political scientists. Most practiced or were strongly oriented toward microeconomics and micropolitics. The commitment to such a line of work was wholly in keeping with Caltech's tradition of not trying to cover all areas of a discipline, but to focus on a especially promising one, as in the case, for example, as it happened in molecular biology, that was ripe for development with new methods and new ideas. Even so, there was grumbling and some resistance to this development among some of the rest of the Institute's faculty. Suspicion of social science, centering on questions of whether it's driven more by ideology than by scientific purpose, have long suffused the American scientific and engineering community, and that kind of suspicion plagued, for example, the creation of the National Science Foundation for a period of years. But Huttenbach and Harold Brown sliced through the suspicion, and soon the Institute faculty approved the establishment of a doctoral program in the social sciences that quickly and deservedly achieved national prominence and respect. Others in this lecture series will recount the development of the social sciences program in the years after its founding. Suffice it to say here that we, meaning me and the social sciences, scientists, and other members of the humanities faculty, we spent a lot of time together, cooking, fishing, working out at noon, playing in the summer softball league, and always talking about our work, the events of the day, and our families. I learned a great deal from my colleagues about economics and political ways of thinking, concerning, for example, investment in public and private goods, and interest group politics at both the congressional and the federal levels. What I learned contributed to my understanding of science in the American democracy. Lance and I co-authored a paper, in fact, on a failed venture to establish a national research fund in the 1920s. We also hatched a proposal that the Luce Foundation funded to establish a professorship with the title, it was a mouthful, law and social change in the technological society. We used to refer to it as the LSMFT professorship, which is not an exact acronym, but those of you who remember radio advertisements will remember it stands for Lucky Strike, means fine tobacco. That led to the appointment of visiting lawyers from USC, including Michael Levine, who was the first, and Michael Gratz, each of whom in different ways opened my eyes to legal issues related to science and technology, and both of whom I see regularly now at NYU Law School and Columbia Law School. So that is, in brief, my living historical version of how the division came to be the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the related development of the transformation and the standards of appointment and promotion and operation in the division. Let me now then turn to the archives. The inspiration to create the Caltech archives came not only from my awareness of the Millikan papers, which were still sitting in the basement of Arms when I returned from a leave in the fall of 1967, but also from what I came to know about the time, about that time, about the papers of George Ellery Hale. Caltech sprang, arguably, at least in conception, from a combination of Hale's vision and entrepreneurial energies. An accomplished, he is on the right, it's Andrew Carnegie on the left. An accomplished solar physicist, he had persuaded Andrew Carnegie early in the century to establish the Mount Wilson Observatory and had invigorated the National Academy of Sciences, mobilizing the Academy for National Defense in World War I by creating the National Research Council, recruiting Robert Millikan to run it, then after the war, persuading Millikan to come to head the then very new Caltech. Sometime in, I think, the fall of 1967, Horace Babcock, who I think was the director, or if not that, the associate director of the Mount Wilson Observatory, asked me to help him decide what to do with Hale's papers, which they were taking up a good deal of space in the observatory's offices on Santa Barbara Street. I'm glad he asked, because I quickly discovered that the collection was huge, bigger even than Millikan's, and rich with correspondence, memoranda, diaries, and even restaurant receipts and train tickets, all of it bearing on Hale's life and career, on Caltech, and on his multiple activities in national and international science from the 1890s to the 1930s. I told Horace Babcock that it was definitely of enormous historical importance, and I would be glad to take it off his hands by moving the collection on an extended temporary loan to Caltech, where we could organize it and perhaps have it microfilmed. He was delighted, and we proceeded along the lines I suggested. The organizing and microfilming of the collection was accomplished with a grant from the National Historical Publications Commission. I wrote a catalog of the collection which filled 100 reels of microfilm. And copies can be found nowadays in libraries in the United States and Europe, and I think in Asia as well. When I was working on or finishing the Hale papers, a letter arrived from Judy Goodstein. She said that she was just finishing her doctorate in the history of, here's Judy on the right from me. She was just finishing her doctorate in the history of science at the University of Washington, was coming to Pasadena with her husband, David Goodstein, who was joining the Caltech physics faculty, and she wondered if she might find a position in the history of science at the Institute. Well, we had no faculty positions available, but Judy's inquiry prompted me to think, here is a possible archivist. All we need is an archive. So I thought to ask President Lee Dubridge for funds to establish one. It was easy to arrange a meeting. All I had to do was call Edith Baker, now my buddy. I soon found myself chatting with Lee in his office in Troop Hall, the sun streaming through the windows. I told Lee about the Hale and Millikan collections and their historical significance. I said that Caltech ought to establish an archive where they could be cared for and made available to other scholars. I added that the archive could be a repository for the papers of other Caltech scientists and engineers when they retired, thus building a vital record of their lives and work and a record of the Institute as well. I also told him about Judy. Lee liked the idea and asked me how much it would cost. I said, estimating a number, about $6,000 a year would be enough to cover a half-time archivist plus expenses for materials. Now, adjusted for inflation, $6,000 then would be about $41K today. Not a trivial sum. But things were easy at Caltech in those days. Without blinking an eye, Lee said, fine, go ahead. So after about 15 minutes, Caltech had an archive. Judy took the job and swiftly took charge. My recollection is that she quickly obtained a grant from the Publications Commission to organize and catalog the Millikan papers. And I think we're talking about them in this picture. She then proceeded to develop the archives, acquiring the papers of other Caltech faculty and building an archive of images as well. She also made the archives a repository for the library of Ernest Watson, a physicist and key administrator with Millikan, who had collected classic scientific works from the 17th century onward. Today, the Caltech archives houses multiple treasures. Here it is. I was going to show pictures of the archives anyway, but on my way over there yesterday to check some of these facts, I ran into a student of Nate Lewis's, and he asked me where I was going, and he helped me find the archives, and he said, what is an archive? So I told him, and now I'm telling you, here is an example of an archive, and a very fine archive. And over there on the right, you see, this is the workspace on the left. On the right are sliding stacks where the archives, where the manuscripts are stored in manuscript storage boxes. And here is a close-up of the Millikan papers. Those were what were in the file drawers in the basement of Arms. There are 100 boxes there, give or take, one or two, depending how you count. So it was a valuable collection, and thank God the Institute hadn't decided to clean house before I got here in 1964. Today, the Caltech Archives houses multiple treasures and is one of the leading repositories of materials for the history of science since the beginning of the 20th century, because Caltech was central and influential beyond belief in the development of science in the world during the 20th century. It's about Caltech stuff, but it's about the world of science as well. Judy herself made wonderful use of the material by writing an engaging, informative, and indispensable history of Caltech through the Dubridge era, Millikan School, and there is a copy of the book on the right. I found it by this one, I have my own back in New York, but I found this one in the writing table of the room in the Athenaeum. Most hotels give you the Gideon Bible. This one gives you Millikan School. The Millikan Hale papers, to turn then to the Institute and my relationship to that. The Millikan and Hale papers were essential for my own historical work, and once I expanded my repertoire into the history of genetics, eugenics, and molecular biology, so were other collections that Judy acquired. But no less important were the current resources of Caltech, principally and above all, its faculty. I calculated at one point that I knew about 80% of the Caltech faculty. A number of them had been students or young faculty at Caltech before World War II. It was not difficult to meet so many faculty, not at least for someone like myself, gregarious and interested in science. Caltech was then, as it is now, small, informal, and for the most part, a welcoming place, a kind of republic of science and scholarship. Of course, historically, it was far from an open republic. When Millikan recruited Paul Epstein from Europe to teach theoretical physics at the new institute, he told Hale that he was wary of hiring someone else like Epstein because We can't afford to have 2 Jews on the faculty. And in the 1930s, Thomas Hunt Morgan declined to hire a geneticist because he was Jewish. Caltech and its anti-Semitism was by no means alone among leading American universities between the wars, but it was also in the vanguard of changing the country's higher academic ways. Jews were among the leaders in the scientific fields in which Caltech wanted to excel. You had to hire them if you wanted to achieve and maintain world-class science, and of course, Caltech did. Millikan, for example, added J. Robert Oppenheimer to the faculty in the 1930s, and Morgan hired Norm Horowitz. It took another 30 years, though, before the barriers to women at Caltech began to fall. By the time I arrived at Caltech, though, faculty at all ranks from the president on down were on a first-name basis, and people cared not about what you were, but what you had to say, at least if you were male. I got to know the faculty in a variety of ways, notably when I expanded my historical repertoire into biology by taking Ed Lewis's course on an introduction to genetics and Max Delbruck's course on molecular biology for physicists. Also by serving on committees such as one on the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that was chaired by Fred Kulik, and another on the aims and goals of the Institute that included Ed Stolper and Peter Dervin, and that led, among other things, to the establishment of Avery House. I also got to know a lot of faculty by joining in the Institute's then active dinner party life, and above all, by frequenting the roundtables at the Athenaeum. My wife, Betty Ann Kevles, who for many years wrote about science for the LA Times, once published a story on faculty clubs in the United States. They were pioneered on the West Coast, and the Athenaeum was one of the first. It was opulently appointed, having been built at the opening of the 1930s with a gift from Alan Balch in the late 1920s that the Institute had the wisdom to cash out before the crash. Like so many other features of the Institute, from the required curriculum to the organization into divisions rather than one discipline departments, the Athenaeum was intended to foster crosstalk between scientists and engineers in different disciplines. From the beginning, it was an appealing gathering place for graduate students, postdocs, and faculty, even though it did not serve alcohol and maintained a tie and jacket required dress code. And here is an example of Caltech, scientists meeting at Caltech during the 1930s at the Athenaeum. And this is Willie Fowler and friends. Loma or Melissa told me which one is Willie, but I forget, so I apologize. Maybe one of you can recognize him. You know, Diana? Fourth from the left. Fourth from the left? Okay. What did you say, Diana? Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Okay. As in the 70s, as I recall, the dress code was relaxed and the prohibition against alcohol abolished. For me, the roundtables were pleasurable, educational, and a very valuable professional resource. My luncheon companions were usually very good company, happy, like to name a few, Jack Roberts, Francis Clauser, Harry Gray, Sam Epstein, Fred Kulik, Jack Richards, Rudy Marcus, or Ahmed Zawel, to chat about the news of the day, political, cultural, scientific, and otherwise. They also provided an ongoing education about their fields: chemistry, astronomy, seismology, geophysics, geochemistry, and biology. And a number of them supplied a treasury of recollections, anecdotes, and lore about the people, programs, and events that you could read about in the archival collections at Caltech and elsewhere, but whom you could not ask about what the letters and memos recorded or didn't record. Along with faculty who did not regularly eat at the round table, they formed a vital link between past and present, a core, if you will, of living history. Some had been students or junior faculty at Caltech before the war, as I earlier mentioned. Among them were Carl Anderson and Victor Nair, who got their start in research with Millikan on cosmic rays, a field that Millikan had helped pioneer in the 1920s. Both told me that they had disputes with Millikan as to the nature of cosmic rays. Here's Carl on the left with a cosmic ray detection apparatus, and Victor Nair in search of cosmic rays with Millikan on the right. Not a good picture, but that's all I could get. Both told me that they had disputes with Millikan as to the nature of cosmic rays, but they both prevailed. Carl, of course, winning a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the positron, and Victor making an international reputation for himself in the field. Bob Christie, a fixture at the round tables, got his start as a theorist with Oppenheimer, migrating with him between Berkeley, where he spent one semester, and Caltech, where he spent the other. There's Robert Oppenheimer here at Caltech. Anderson told me a bunch of stories about his work with cosmic rays and Millikan, but he also told me about taking Oppenheimer's course in quantum mechanics when Oppenheimer first came here, sometime in the early 30s. Oppenheimer stood at the blackboard, a cigarette in his left hand, a piece of chalk in his right hand, constantly smoking, dropping ashes all over himself and the floor, and scribbling equations that no one could understand, and no one could hear what he was trying to say to explain them. One by one, the course, which started out full, Carl told me, emptied out until he was the only one left. He said that Oppenheimer came to him and begged him to stay in the course so that he would have a viable course. So Carl did. And then he told me that lots of the students who dropped out the first year took it again the next. And Oppenheimer, by that time, had learned how to deliver lectures at a blackboard. And in fact, as we know from all the stories about Oppenheimer, he became one of the most eloquent and captivating teachers of theoretical physics in the country. Along with Carl, Bob, and Vic, most of the physical scientists and engineers I encountered at the round tables had been part of the wartime mobilization, that is World War II, developing microwave radar at MIT, solid fuel rockets at China Lake, California, in a project run by Caltech, jet-assisted takeoff in the Pasadena Arroyo at the lab that would become the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or designing and building the atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project. Lee Dubridge had run the radiation laboratory at MIT, mightily assisted by Robert F. Bacher. Christie at Los Alamos had figured out how to make a bomb with plutonium, and several engineers, Duncan Ranney, Frank Marble, Homer Joe Stewart, and Francis Clauser, had worked on wartime rockets or aircraft projects. During the post-war years, a number of the same scientists and engineers had become deeply involved in issues of national security and federal science policy. Bob Bacher, for example, was a member of the Atomic Energy Commission, and Lee Dubridge, a member of multiple defense advisory committees, as well as the President's Science Advisory Committee. And there is Eisenhower with Lee on his left, I. Rabi on Lee's left, and I could parse some of the others. I don't have time. And there is Lee with, I believe that's Clark Millikan on Lee's right, who was a prominent aeronautical engineer on the Caltech faculty, one of Millikan's sons, and of course Nixon on Lee's left. I believe that they are at JPO. They were thus, these people whom I had lunch with, they were thus very much engaged in public affairs. They are, of course, careful in their lunchtime conversations not to violate security rules, but they had no hesitation in telling you what they thought about this or that policy and the values they brought to their advisory tasks. Some were political conservatives, many were liberals, but all struck me as adhering to a code of human decency, as each struggled in his way to prevent the world from hurtling to some thermonuclear Armageddon. Biologists, for reasons known only to them, have always been scarce at the round tables, but some dined there, notably Ed Lewis, Ray Owen, Norm Horowitz, Lee Hood, and on occasion, Max Delbruck. I got to know Max and Lee very well. Lee opened my eyes to the crucial role of instrumentation in biology, telling me about the development of the fast DNA sequencing machines that he initially devised here in his lab at Caltech. A prime mover with several others in the Human Genome Project, he was sensitive to the broader ethical implications of the project and its likely consequences for biology and medicine. So in 1992, shortly after the project got well underway, we organized a lecture series, Lee and I did, here at Caltech, on the project and turned it into a book that's still in print, The Code of Codes, Scientific and Social Issues in the Human Genome Project. Max, the son of a prominent German historian, who was also a member, I believe, of the German parliament at one point, was interested in history, liked what I had written about physicists, and encouraged me in my writings about biology. He had taken a doctorate in physics in the early days of quantum mechanics and had been inspired to turn to genetics upon hearing a lecture by Niels Bohr in Copenhagen on light and life. Bohr had devised quantum theory, I'm sure many of you know, by analyzing the spectra of the simplest element, hydrogen. Max wanted to find the equivalent of a hydrogen atom for genetics, and he came upon it, phage, that is viruses that prey on bacteria, here at Caltech, when one day, while a postdoc here, he walked by chance into the lab of a young scientist interested in cancer named Emory Ellis. Max went on to lay the foundations of molecular biology by establishing the phage school, along with Albert Hershey and Salvador Luria. I vividly remember the day that their Nobel was announced. When Max walked into the Athenaeum for lunch, a lunch appointment, the entire room erupted in cheers and applause. A look of puzzlement came over Max's face. He stopped and turned around, expecting to see what celebrity might be following him into the dining room. It took a few seconds before he realized that the star of the day was, in fact, him. I could hear Max's practical, unpretentious voice when I read his correspondence with George Beadle in the biology division's records in the archives. They were figuring out how to redirect a gift from someone in San Marino for research on shingles, to turn that gift into a fund for research on animal virology. Max used the money to they succeeded, and Max used the money to bring Renato Dulbecco to Caltech as a postdoc in the early 1950s. Dulbecco adapted the techniques of phage research in service of understanding the behavior of animal viruses. I came to understand that a direct line runs from Dulbecco's work at that point to the work of Howard Temin and David Baltimore, each independently identifying the enzyme, reverse transcriptase, that enables the integration of the genetic information of retroviruses into a cell's genome. These accomplishments merited a joint Nobel and laid the foundation for the discovery of oncogenes in the late 1970s. The archives thus revealed that Max, in helping Beadle find a way to use the shingles money for animal virology, was not only a father of molecular biology, but, if you will, a grandfather of the revolution in the scientific understanding of cancer that is now well underway, and kind of a closing of the circle between Emory Ellis and contemporary oncogenetic research. Well, I could go on for quite a while longer, but I'm not going to tax your attention. Much of my life was led for the third of a century that I was here at Caltech, between the archives and the Athenaeum, not to mention on the softball field and in the swimming pool, and in the homes and friends and in the greasy and so on, and in places, in short, of all the professional and personal amenities that Caltech has so generously provided. I'm not going to try to finish with a kind of small sermon about the importance of maintaining the Athenaeum and the archives. I think it's obvious. It's certainly essential that all that lay in between that was so helpful to me, that is the maintenance, the recruitment and maintenance of a world-class distinguished faculty in all fields, is essential to the future of the Institute. Thank you.